lesson 5, school-aged. Now, although ADHD symptoms may present from early in life, it's not until school age that ADHD is typically diagnosed. In fact, ADHD is most often diagnosed about the age of 7, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, and that usually has to do with the severity of the ADHD symptoms. So when a child has relatively mild symptoms of ADHD, that diagnosis may be made a little bit later, whereas those with more severe symptoms of ADHD, the symptoms may be made much younger. And as I mentioned in lesson 4, sometimes it's even made in the preschool aged years. But when you close your eyes and think of a child with ADHD, you are most likely thinking of the typical presentation of a child, a school-aged child, especially with ADHD. More specifically, you are likely thinking of a school-aged boy with what we would call ADHD combined type. This child is usually fidgety, distracted, impulsive, can't sit still, can't focus on anything for more than a few moments at a time. They are students who have to be reminded of the rules and expectations again and again and again and again. They are forgetful and often have difficulty following multi-step directions. They lose things, including their homework, which is probably actually in the bottom of their backpacks, which is also a disorganized mess. They make careless mistakes and struggle with reading comprehension just because they have difficulty keeping all of that information in their mind at the same time. It's not that they can't do it, it's that their brains make it difficult for them to hold all that information in there. Now there's another type of ADHD that also emerges during this developmental stage, and that requires a little bit more attention. That is called the ADHD predominantly inattentive type. Now, I'm going to take a moment here and talk a little bit about the difference between ADHD and ADD. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, while ADD is attention deficit disorder. When I hear people talk about ADHD versus ADD, typically the differentiation is pretty obvious. ADHD is hyperactive impulsive. ADD is not, it's just inattentive. Now, in reality, the difference between ADHD and ADD really just comes down to the diagnostic manual or diagnostic codes that are used by the physician who provided the diagnosis. ADHD is the way that the American Psychiatric Association defines what we call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, while attention deficit disorder is what the World Health Organization identifies as ADD or ADHD. They're the same codes, they're the same exact diagnostic criteria. The difference is just the organization who puts the information together and what they chose to call it. So while the World Health Organization and the ICD, or the International Classification of Diseases, that's a very hefty book that has all the diagnoses that we make in it, while that book classifies it as attention deficit disorder or attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity, so it'd be ADD or ADDH, the American Psychiatric Association, through their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, calls it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder combined type, meaning inattentive and hyperactive impulsive. ADHD predominantly hyperactive impulsive type, which, as the name suggests, is ADHD, but the main issues are hyperactivity and impulsivity, not really a lot of inattentive behaviors. And then the third subtype is ADHD predominantly inattentive type, which is that there's no hyperactivity or impulsivity, it's just primarily inattention that the child struggles with. So the difference really is semantic and perhaps just the source of the diagnosis. When I see people diagnosed with ADD, it's usually a pediatrician or general practitioner that makes that diagnosis. On the other hand, if the person is diagnosed with ADHD, it's usually a psychologist or some other person in the mental health field that makes that diagnosis. Now, with that sort of that point made, I want to talk a little bit about what ADD means, or what ADHD predominantly inattentive type means. While we used to think that ADHD was primarily a disorder affecting boys, it was usually boys that were diagnosed, and the prevalency rate still continues to be heavily leaning in the direction of boys. we just didn't think that girls had ADHD as often as boys. It was pretty clear. Now, what we have since learned is that children with ADHD present very differently based upon their symptom presentation. Boys oftentimes have the hyperactivity, impulsivity symptoms that we think of as that classic ADHD presentation. Girls, on the other hand, as we have learned over time, have that primary inattentive type. They may not be hyperactive, they may not be impulsive, but they are inattentive. So these students sort of are the ones who sit in the back of the room and daydream. They can't focus or sustain attention and concentration, but unlike their inattentive and hyperactive and impulsive counterparts, these children sit quietly. They are sort of disappearing in the back of the classrooms, and people really don't pay any attention to them because they're not causing any disruption. They just sit there, daydream, look out the window, and aren't really paying attention. They may be seen as academically weak. They may be less engaged. They may be seen as off task even, or even just as daydreamers. But because they don't make a disruption, because they're not loud, because they're not impulsive, because they don't intrude on others, they're not identified as often as children with those more disruptive behaviors. So with all that in mind, it's important to now recognize that girls with ADHD predominantly inattentive type, are being diagnosed a little bit more often than they once were. Now, back to ADHD during the school-aged years. There are two primary concerns during this developmental period. The first is the possible impact that ADHD symptoms have on the academic foundation. Now, elementary school, as you know, provides the foundation for all higher education. Whether it's learning the multiplication tables or discovering strategies for reading comprehension, these early educational experiences will influence the remainder of the student's academic career. So when a child has ADHD, they're not able to focus, they're not able to concentrate, they're not able to gain the skills that they are going to need in the future, we end up with students who have an educational foundation that has weak points. That leads us to the importance of early identification. It's important to identify children with ADHD early so that we can begin interventions, not necessarily medication, but we can begin interventions and strategies as early as possible to have the least impact on their educational foundation. Now, the second primary concern during this stage of development is the nature of the parent-child relationship. To put it quite simply, parents of ADHD children get frustrated. They feel ineffective in their ability to manage their child's behavior. They're bewildered by the need to repeat themselves hundreds, if not thousands of times. They're even angered and enraged at times by what appears to be the child's deliberate attempts to push limits and break rules. Now, these issues are difficult for the parent, and it affects their relationship with their child, and it makes it sometimes extremely difficult to have a healthy relationship, the kind of relationship that's needed to navigate the natural turmoil that comes later on, especially during adolescence. So this stage of development, again, calls for the importance of early identification and treatment to make sure that the parent-child relationship remains healthy, has a good beginning, so that they can handle some of the stress and challenges that are going to come later on. Now, all of these issues culminate in the relationship issues between the child and his parents, the child and his teachers, and between the child and his peers. So while ADHD is primarily a disorder of attention, overactivity, impulsivity, and those kinds of things, during this stage of development, the ADHD symptoms will often impact the child's relationships with others and could result in the later development of anxiety, depression, self-esteem problems, and those kinds of things. It's also during this stage of development that we tend to see our first round of medication prescribed for children with ADHD. Now, we're going to discuss that a lot more in Unit 3. We're going to talk about what the different types of medications are and what they're meant to do. And we're also going to spend a lot of time in Unit 4 talking about skills and strategies that are useful and important in dealing with some of these concerns during the school-age years, especially as it relates to the parent-child relationship, social skills, and those kinds of things. So I hope this helps give you a little bit better of an idea about what we see in some of the underlying challenges for the school-age child with ADHD. Again, we tend to intuitively know what it is that a child with the classic symptoms of ADHD looks like as a school-age child. But some of these underlying sub-concerns, sub-diagnostic concerns that we see in children with ADHD are also important to recognize and for us to acknowledge. So, hope this helps. Again, as always, please write to us in the comments section if you have any questions, comments, or observations that you would like to share, and we would love to hear from you. Thanks, and we'll see you in the next lesson.